let me set the stage for you really quick. This is what happened in the previous couple of weeks that Shane was here, and he was telling us kind of a build up towards where we're going to land today. Esther is really interesting for many reasons. One is that the book of Esther is one story, the entire book. It's pretty incredible. And so there seems to be a very significant emphasis on this story. The entire book is about one story. It's pretty interesting. In this entire book, we don't see the name of God 5 times, 4 times, 3 times. We don't actually see the name of God at all. 0 times. So you're like, well, how can that be a book in the Bible? Great question. I think it's extremely purposeful. I think the point of the series, which we had up here a second ago, said it's seeing what is it again? The unseen hand of God. Seeing God with our spiritual eyes, because our physical eyes are showing us that he's not there. And so I think it's purposeful that God isn't mentioned in Esther, because that's the motif, that's the point of the story. The question is, that God is asking us is, can you see me? Can you see me in this story? Will you find me in this story? This sermon it has like 100 applications. Like, I could apply it to sewing and mechanic work and therapy where I work. And I mean, there's so many amazing applications. It's crazy. But I really feel like this story today is for someone in this room. Someone in this room who has been attacked by the enemy, who is being attacked by the enemy, or who is going to be attacked by the enemy. This is for someone who feels like right now life is extremely scary, and I don't know how God is going to pull through on this one. I don't see him pulling through. I feel like everything's coming against me. If that's you in this room, this is your Sunday. This is what God wants you to hear. It's that he's at work even when you can't see him. Because we walk by faith, not by sight. Even if our eyes are showing us that our enemy and the attack is mounting up and it's huge, when you look just a little bit more above that with your spiritual eyes, you see how much bigger God is. Way bigger. How much bigger is he than all your enemies? Really? So, Esther is an orphan and a Jew, and she gets wrapped up into this business with the king, becoming the queen of King Xerxes' kingdom. This is how it happens. So there's this king in the story. We have 4 characters, 4. I'm going to introduce you to all of them. First is King Xerxes. His name is very interesting. His full name, which is Ahasuerus, sounds like a dinosaur. It's not, but Ahasuerus is a name that signifies deity. So this is a king. He's a Persian king back in the old days, and he is making it very obvious that he believes, and the people should believe as well, that he is basically like a god. So we have King Xerxes, and he gets really mad at his wife. So his wife's name is Vashti, and she decides to reject one of his requests for her presence. She says, no, I'm not going to let you boss me around. He says, okay, well, you're no longer queen. You're no longer queen, and I'm going to replace you. He replaces her with Esther. Esther becomes the queen. An unlikely person to take that type of role. But we know, as there are so many stories in Scripture, that God is very famous for recruiting unlikely heroes, for recruiting those who the world would probably see as not qualified, not good enough, not smart enough, and God, because of the way he sees, chooses them. to do these mighty and amazing things. We're talking about an orphan who is a Jew, has no real royalty background, has nothing really going for her other than her looks, apparently. She has some good looks. And God uses her to do an incredible salvation of the Jews. And you'll see that as we continue on the story. Okay, so we have the king. We have Esther. Esther's uncle is a very important figure. Esther's uncle is Mordecai. And Mordecai raised Esther, and he's gotten into some trouble. Here's what happens. There is this last person. His name is Haman. Haman is what probably most of us would call a narcissist. And we'll talk about the evidence for that in a second. But essentially, he's a pretty evil dude, very pompous. He cares about status. He cares about being the number one and for everybody to see him and think, oh my gosh, this guy's incredible. So Mordecai, which is Esther's uncle, he is around this other guy, Haman, and Haman is really egotistical, and so he expects people to bow down when he walks around. Of course, right? I expect that too. Come on, right? It's normal. You expect people to bow down. No, he's so egotistical, he thinks everybody should bow down, and Mordecai doesn't. Mordecai's like, no. I only bow down to one person, and that's God. The Lord God Almighty is the only person I bow down to. I'm not bowing down to you. Haman is an interesting person. Not only is he evil and terrible, but he actually comes from a long lineage of people who hate Jews. He's a descendant of King Agag, which, if you remember, don't look it up now, but trust me on this, in Exodus and Deuteronomy, we hear about what Agag did to the Jews. He wanted to kill them and slaughter them and destroy them. And we have his great-great-grandson here trying to do the same thing. So he gets his feelings hurt that Mordecai doesn't bow down to him. And so you know what he does? I mean, he just goes leaps and bounds above what is an appropriate response, which is, maybe I should check myself and see why I'm so offended by this. Instead, he goes to the king and says, you know those scummy, really rude and disobedient Jews? Let's kill them all. And the king, he's a little bit of a fluff head, not much of a head on his shoulders. He says, sure, that sounds great. Sounds wonderful, let's do it. So the king sends out a message to 127 provinces. It's a lot of people. And there's a decree. The decree is kill all the Jews. Now remember, I told you that the king, and the way the people perceive the king is they perceive him as divinity. So what he says is coming from the mouth of God. It has to be done. It has to be executed. Mordecai freaks out, understandably. His people, his family, everybody he loves is about to be executed. So he thinks, well, wait a minute. I got somebody in my back pocket here. My niece. My niece is the queen. I'll encourage her to talk to the king. But there's a problem. The problem is that you can't just walk up and talk to the king. In Persian culture, you walk up to the king uninvited and you will be killed on the spot. You don't just walk up unless he asks you to come and to make your request known to him. So Mordecai says to Esther in the famous words of chapter 4, verse 13, Esther, maybe, who knows, but perhaps you've got this place in the kingdom for such a time as this. Maybe this is your moment. Maybe God orchestrated this whole thing without you knowing for this moment in time to save our people. But Esther realizes the gravity of what he's saying. She says, that is pretty scary. For instance, we see in Esther 4:16, she says, okay, have everybody, and have all the Jews in our community observe a fast for 3 days. Don't eat or drink day and night. This is 4:16. And my maids will also fast the same way. Then, after fasting, I'll go to see the king without being summoned, which is against the law. but if I perish, I perish. Talk about bravery. I am not on that level, let me tell you. I'm like, and she, Esther, I learn a lot from her. I need to grow, for sure. But she has a deep faith that God has brought her to that place as queen to save the Jews. So she's going to do it. This actually reminds me of Proverbs 31. It talks about you've all heard Proverbs 31 woman. It's really interesting. One verse says in verses 8 and 9 that a Proverbs 31 woman is a leader who secures justice for the oppressed. So she's going to go and fight for those and give voice to those who have no voice. That brings us to the start of the sermon. Can you believe it? We haven't started. Okay. Hang on, folks. Hang on. There's coffee downstairs if you need it. Okay. We're going to start in Esther chapter 5, verse 1. And I'm just going to read this out to you and let the word of the Lord speak for itself. So on the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes because previously she was grieving and fasting. So she was in these other types of clothes that are not so appropriate to approach a king. So she finishes the fast, puts on her robes, stood in the inner court of the king's palace, and the king was sitting on the royal throne facing the main entrance of the palace. Something we learn really quick, just from the first verse in chapter 5, is that Esther is taking her time here. A 3-day fast. I mean, the entire people group is about to be exterminated. She's taking her time. But I don't really think it's necessarily out of fear. I think she's seeking God. Maybe her fear is driving her to seek God and get wisdom on what to do. That's oftentimes a better reaction than being scared about a situation and taking it into your own hands. Maybe I should ask God about this. Maybe I should pray. Maybe I should fast. And maybe he'll just deposit a little nugget of wisdom in my brain for what to do next. But she has a lot to fast and pray about. She's very concerned. King Xerxes has proven himself to be a complete lunatic, to be honest. He's absolutely unpredictable. For instance, do you remember when I told you he got rid of his queen? Listen to this in Esther 1:12. But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command, so the king became extremely angry, burned with rage. He was extremely angry. I mean, he's just volatile. He was just quick to the wick. And so Esther, as she's approaching the throne, as she's coming up to talk to the king, unsummoned, illegally, she's thinking, okay, this guy is an angry dude. Like, he might explode on me. Okay, there's more that is on her mind as well. That's not the only thing. She knows also that what she's going to have to ask the king to do is impossible. He made a decree, and he's king. He's divinity in this place. So she's going to have to go and say, dude, can you reverse that decree that you sent to 127 provinces and look like a complete idiot because you made a mistake? This is not something you can request of a king. So she has to do the impossible here. The impossible under impossible circumstances, under the threat of his anger and of the law. So, yeah, I think it's appropriate that she fasted for 3 days. It's kind of a big deal. Because what is at risk is the loss of tens and hundreds of thousands of lives. So let's keep going forward here. Verse 2. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she found favor in his sight. The king extended the golden scepter, which was in his hand, so that Esther could approach and touch it. There are many evidences, I think, of God working in this story, and this is one of them. Not only did he bring her in an impossible way from being an orphan nobody to now the queen, that was definitely God, Another movement of God that we see is that she's expecting to be completely ridiculed and condemned as she approaches the king. And the king, as we see, had favor in his eyes for his wife. That is a crazy move of God, that there would be grace in his eyes for his queen. He probably also realizes that if she's doing this, she's taking this risk, it's because it's for something extremely serious. So he's probably a little concerned. So it's a miracle. She didn't get killed. Well, what happens next? A lot of crazy stuff. Here we go. Verse 3. Then the king said to her, Esther, what's troubling you? What's on your mind? What's going on? What is your request? It shall be given to you, and I'll even give you half of the kingdom. I'll give you anything you want. What do you need? And Esther says, if it pleases the king, in verse 4, may the king and Haman come on this day to the banquet that I've prepared for them. What kind of weird request is this? Bro, everybody's about to die. All the Jews are about to die, and you're asking the king if him and Haman, remember the guy from the beginning I told you about, who helped construct the death of all the Jews in his attempt to kill all the Jews, you want them to go to lunch? That's what you're concerned about? I really think Esther was being strategic here. At this time in Persian culture, one way to gain the interest of a king is to come multiple times with your request, to kind of lure him in, to kind of get him excited and enticed about the final request. The king probably realizes that she's going to ask for something else, and probably in his mind it's going to be at the lunchtime that they're about to have. So he says, okay, verse 5, bring Haman super fast so that we can do exactly what Esther said. And the king and Haman came to the lunch banquet with Esther, the food that she had prepared. So the king is trying to get to the bottom of this. What is she really asking about? She obviously she risked her life, her reputation, to stand in front of me. She's asking for us to go to a lunch. Okay, well, let's make the lunch happen, and let's go and see what happens. Let's get to the bottom of this. So he asks her again. Verse 6. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, Esther, really, what is your petition? I will give it to you. Whatever your request is, I'll even give you, again, half the kingdom. And Esther, she must really like food. Esther replied, my petition is this. Again, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and it pleases the king to grant my petition, do as I request. May the king and Haman come to the banquet that I've prepared for them tomorrow. And I will do as the king says and express my request. I'll tell you there what's going down. But can y'all come to dinner tomorrow? Okay, I'm getting stressed out just reading this because I know that a bunch of people are about to die. And she's over here cooking. Very interesting. That tells me that something else is going on. That tells me that God is up to something, and I'll prove it to you. I think it wasn't time to reveal the request from Esther because a couple of variables that we'll see later on in the story weren't at play yet. I think that God was preparing the king's heart to receive the request because it's going to be a gnarly one. And what we're about to see is I think God wanted to reveal the depth of Haman's narcissistic, egotistical, evil heart. He wanted to show the readers, to show us, and to show them the fullest extent of where hatred and pride will take you. So we're going to see it here. Okay. Guess what? Haman, verse 9, he went away very joyful and in good spirits. He's like, wow, I'm a little special. The queen's choosing me. She wants me to be at this really fancy dinner. It's incredible. So he makes his way home. But when he saw Mordecai, Esther's uncle, at the gate, refusing to stand up and respect him, he was filled with boiling rage. He was like, I just got all this attention from the queen, from the king, and this dude, this Jew, still won't show me respect. Hit his ego deeply. And so what does he do? Well, he controlled himself as much as he could, as it was just burning up. And you know what he did? He called his friends. And his friends haven't been very good to him, very good at giving him advice. But he calls them nevertheless, and he calls his wife. Haman recounted to them the glory of all of his riches, how many sons he has, which is something they're very proud of in this time. And he wanted to highlight to them, he wanted to remind them and himself every instance in which the king had magnified him and how he had promoted Haman over all the officials and servants. This is weird. But is it that weird? We all know this guy or girl. We all know this person in our life who, when their ego gets hurt, they need the approval of everybody else. They need the braggamony. They need someone to make them feel better. And so this is Haman's way of doing this. He was offended by Mordecai, and he needed a little ego boost. We all know that guy. And I have been that guy a number of times, to be quite honest. So, Haman also said, guess what? Not only do I have a bunch of riches, not only do I have a bunch of kids, not only am I amazing, but Queen Esther let no one but me come to the king, to the banquet that she has prepared. I'm invited to go. She personally invited me. Guys, it's shocking. Reading this story as a therapist, that's what I do for a profession. I immediately thought when I read this, first of all, I thought, I've kind of said stuff like that in my head before, hey, she chose me, it's pretty nice. But this came after a big ego hit, and after him calling his friends over. What kind of friend you invite over and they're just talking about themselves the whole time? We know that guy. And as a therapist, I'm thinking, this guy actually sounds like a legit narcissist, like diagnosable. Well, lo and behold, there are 9 criteria for being diagnosed a narcissist. 9 criteria. There's 3 people in the Bible who meet the full criteria. Haman is one of them. And I have all the beautiful verses to back it up because it is just so incredibly obvious. And at the end of the sermon, I'm going to put a little QR code up so you can have all 20 pages of these notes, and you can have this little narcissistic personality assessment. It's very interesting. But I couldn't preach without talking about therapy. So this is going to come into play, though, in just a few more verses. What being one of the 3 narcissists in Scripture, like legit narcissists in Scripture, means and what happens to them. So, Haman's going on his braggamony. Even the queen invited me. I must be amazing. But, verse 13, it takes a weird twist. Yet, all of this does not satisfy me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. It's all for nothing. All my money, all my sons, all this special attention, it means nothing if that guy won't show me respect. This is how intense this guy's ego is. It is incredible. His hatred for Mordecai was stronger than all the wealth and power he had at his disposal. So, of course, his wonderful friends and his wife give him some excellent advice. Verse 14, His wife Zeresh and the friends said, "Easy solution. Why don't you build a gallows 75 feet high?" Do you know how high that is? That's extremely high for a gallows. So that you can have the king kill Mordecai on it. I mean, 75 feet is like overkill. It's like, do you really got to build it that high? I mean, like, really? Like, that's like two of these, that's like 4 stories. I don't even know. It's a lot, okay? I did the math one day, and I forgot it. But I will tell you this, that in the Old Testament time, in this Persian kind of context, they didn't really hang people. Instead, they were constructing a large spike to impale him. Okay? So they wanted to completely destroy Mordecai's reputation, shame him, embarrass him even post-death by having him impaled on this big contraption, this big spike. A really high one, too, which you'll see is very important later on. And I mentioned this last sermon, but I think it's worth mentioning it again, that Haman shows us exactly who not to be. He shows us exactly how we should not respond, but he also shows us the depth of what's possible in our hearts too. And even Jesus says it himself. He says, if you hate someone, you're committing murder in your heart. I mean, it's all accessible to all of us. We've all been there. This is what I told my friend last night who's struggling with some relationship issues. I told him, you will know that you are healing from that wound that the person caused you when you can finally bless them. When you can finally say, God, I hope the best for them. I hope they find you. I hope they find your love. When you can bless your enemy, that is evidence that you have moved into a whole different part of your healing. If there's an enemy in your heart, someone who's hurt you that you think about right now, and it's hard for you to bless them, it's hard for you to just give them over to God and trust God and his goodness with them, it's okay, because we all have someone like that in our heart at the moment. It takes time to give this kind of wound over to God, but I will tell you, keep track of that. When your heart finally switches over and you're able to wish the best on that person, it's a sign that God has done a mighty work in your heart and that you're healing. Verse 1 of chapter 6. The story's going to get pretty intense, as you will see. So, on that night, the king couldn't sleep, and which is pretty typical for royalty at this time. He just asked his bookkeeper, his guy with the scrolls, an attendant, to come into his room and recount the history of how great I am, recount the history of the things that we've accomplished in the kingdom. It's a pretty normal thing, just to get your mind off of not being able to sleep. So he asked someone to come in and go over the memorial deeds, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. An interesting story came to the king through this recalling of the history. It happened to be about Mordecai. Check this out. Verse 2. So it was found written there how Mordecai had reported that Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the eunuchs who were doorkeepers, planned to attack the king. So the scribe guy, or the attendant, is reading all these different things about the kingdom, and then he hits this one story about Mordecai and how Mordecai reported these eunuchs who were planning to kill the king. And the king's like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that story. That's amazing, And it just so happened that he was reminded of this in between that first lunch and the dinner that they're going to have tomorrow with Haman. Do you see what's happening here? God dropped a little nugget in his brain to remind him, like, hey, remember, this guy He's earned your respect, and he's been loyal. Which brings the king to another question. What honor or distinction has been given Mordecai for this? What reward has been given to him? Because the kings of this time, they like to reward loyalty in a public way so that it encourages everybody else in the community to be loyal to the king. It's like, whoa, if I'm loyal to the king, then I get rewarded. Sign me up, you know? So the king also feels obligated to give a reward to someone who is loyal to him because that's kind of how it's always been. It's the respectful thing to do. You give a reward to the person who's loyal to you or saved your life or whatever. So he asked the guy, okay, what does it say in the scroll about what he was rewarded with? The servant said, nothing has been done for him. Mordecai didn't get anything. Nothing. This is an interesting point, like many points, of course. There's probably a good reason why Mordecai did not get a reward. In my mind, it is Mordecai didn't remind him. Mordecai wasn't begging and seeking the reward, seeking fame, seeking, approval from the king. Exactly the opposite of who? Haman. Haman wants the approval. He wants to show everybody how glamorous he is and be rewarded. But Mordecai didn't save the king for glory. He did it out of honor for the king. He wasn't trying to do it to glamorize himself. So this kind of makes the king responsible for issuing a reward. So the king's he's gonna make this happen. Verse 4. So the king asks, this is early morning, he asks, who's in the court? Haman happened to just be entering the court, and the king's thinking, perfect, I'll get this guy to go do this reward thing for me. So Haman just enters the court because he was waiting for the gates to open so he could go in to be number one to ask the king to kill Mordecai. All the while, God just reminded the king of Mordecai's loyalty and why his life is worth saving, why his life is worth honoring. Anyway, the king's servant said to him, oh, look, it's just Haman standing in the court. The king said, let him in, quick, bring him in here. Haman came in, and the king said to him, before you request anything from me, Haman, because you're always coming here needy, asking for something, before you request anything, let me ask you a question. What do you think should be done for someone who the king wants to honor? And now Haman thought to himself, I love how the Bible illustrates some of the thoughts of these people. It's crazy. It makes it more relatable. Whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Oh my goodness. The king must be talking about me. He must be preparing something awesome, and he's trying to figure out what I would want, because obviously I'm the guy he wants to honor. Goes without saying. So Haman doesn't hold back any punches. He gives the king a long list of all the things that guy deserves, and we find it here. Haman said, "Oh, king, let me be modest as I put this request before you. This submission before you. For the man whom the king desires to honor," just so sweet, "bring him the royal robe, but it has to be a robe that the king already wore. Bring him a horse, but it has to be a horse that the king has already ridden. And make sure that horse has a nice royal crown. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him dress the man whom the king delights to honor with the royal robe, so that he can be led throughout the city on horseback. And have the attendant, whoever is with this wonderful, honorable guy, scream from as loud as he possibly can to everybody there This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor. This guy. This is what happens. Dressed up nice, got a nice horse, and everybody in the town is about to find out that this is a special man. Man, he's about to get all the attention. So, the king says to Haman, quickly take the royal robe and the royal horse, and as you have said, do this for Mordecai the Jew. Yikes. Like, that had to hurt. That had to hurt. He was going to have to take his mortal enemy up and down the streets, holding his horse and screaming to everyone, look at this guy. The king honors this man, with a smile on his face. He was just planning Mordecai's death. Dear God, the plot twists get crazier, if you can believe it. So, verse 11, Haman took the royal robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai. Can you imagine your enemy, you're putting on clothes for them, and it's the royal robe that you thought was yours and you were going to wear it, and dear God, this is very complicated. He must have a lot going on in his mind. And I bet you that Mordecai, this is my guess, was probably a little stinky because he just got done fasting and praying in sackcloth and ashes for 3 days. So it's a little gross undertaking to dress up your arch nemesis when he stinks of, not having bathed for 3 days, perhaps. Anyway, Mordecai got dressed, and Haman led him on horseback through the square in the city, proclaiming, this is what shall be done for the guy that the king really likes, He's like, I cannot believe I've been put in this position. It's so humiliating. I hate this dude, like literally, vilely hate this man. And now I have to go around screaming this. So this is what happens. After the wonderful show, Mordecai returns to the king's gate to work. He goes back to the gate to work because that's just who he is. He's not looking for extra. He's not like, let's go to the bar and celebrate my great, wonderful way through the city where everybody just saw me and thought I was great, and we can reflect on it like Haman, right? Haman's like, let's talk about how amazing I am, and let's do that for a really long time because it feels really good. No, Mordecai went back to work. Haman, on the other hand, after being severely embarrassed, he scurried over to his house, mourning and with his head covered in shame. Which is interesting. So the tables have turned. Mordecai was just mourning the edict that all the Jews would be killed. He was in mourning, sackcloth and ashes, while he was fasting and praying. Then he's promoted and elevated. And what we see now is Haman is mourning and embarrassed. There's a certain type of jealousy. There's a flavor of jealousy in the Bible that is really potent. And we see it a number of times in a number of stories. One story that comes to mind, or that came to mind while I was reading this, is of King Saul. He was a freak. I'm not going to lie. This guy went crazy with anger and jealousy. This is one quote from King Saul, if you don't believe me. 1 Samuel 18:8 says, Saul was very, very angry. And this saying, this phrase, really displeased him. Here's the phrase. Why have they ascribed to David tens and thousands, and to me they only ascribe thousands? That's what he was jealous about, is that David got a little bit more of the praise. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And it caused him to go crazy and to try and kill David. But what we see in this story and what we see in all the stories where jealousy appears and hatred is, there is a special end for people who take hatred all the way to its final destination. There is a special result that occurs, and it's not pretty. Any of us led by pure hatred will find a very uncomfortable conclusion. So Haman told Zareth, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. He's complaining, "Can you believe this? I had to go drag this horse around, put Mordecai on it, dress him up, make him look pretty, tell everybody about this. Can you believe this?" His wife said to him, it's a little different tone this time. "If Mordecai, before whom you've begun to fall in status," hearing that from your wife. You know, the guy, the Jew that you really hate, and you're kind of below him now. You know, you've begun to fall in status. What a kind way of putting it. Fall in status is of Jewish heritage. If he's a Jew, you will not overcome him, but you will fall before him. "I thought you were my cheerleader, girl. I thought you had my back." No, she's saying, if he's a Jew, I'm willing to bet, I've heard the stories about their God. You're going down. You're going to go down. Which, as I mentioned last sermon, was that it's interesting because this reminds me of another wife who gave advice during a very critical moment. Do you remember Pilate's wife? She had the dream. She goes and tells Pilate, "We need to wash our hands of this," to help Pilate, have a way out. Doesn't listen. So, in this verse 13, can you pull it up for me? In verse 13, you see on that second line, or the third line, it says to fall. That word in Hebrew is the exact word that is used describing Satan's fall, when Satan fell from heaven, which further aligns, and you'll see it in a second, how similar Satan and how much similarities there is between Satan and Haman. So I'll tell you right now then, I'll just give you the scoop. Remember I told you there's three classic narcissists in the Bible? Here they are. 1, Haman, obviously, meets all 9 criteria. 2, Satan. Satan's a narcissist, obviously, right? Makes sense. Egocentric, was the highs of the highs. Everybody, he was the leader of the choir and, high esteem, and fell. So he's a classic narcissist. Haman's a classic narcissist. And so is, do you remember this one? Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar actually meets all 9 criteria for narcissism. But here's where they differ. What happens to Satan, what the Bible says happens to Satan, is that one day he'll be destroyed. Unrepentant, unredeemable. What happens to Nebuchadnezzar is he's humbled. He repents, comes back to God, or he aligns his understanding with respect for God. There is hope for narcissists, contrary to popular belief. We see it in Nebuchadnezzar. It just takes an ungodly amount of you going through the humbling process, usually not of your own choice. It's usually put on you. Maybe God wants to root that narcissism out. So there is hope for narcissists. Is there hope for Haman? Let's find out. Let's see if he repents and says, "You know what, I was wrong, and let's not kill all these Jews." Let's see what he does. While they were still speaking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried and brought Haman through the banquet that Esther prepared. So now they're ushering Haman into dinner. So the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. The king said to Esther on the second day, as they drank their wine, "Esther, really, you've put on a big show. We were eating with you yesterday, got dinner tonight, we're all here. Just tell me what you want. Tell me the truth. What's your request?" The queen said to him, "King, if I have found favor in your sight, and it pleases the king, let my life be spared as my petition, and my people be spared as my request." She could have just said, can you spare me from this, massive killing spree? And I know it's probably too much to ask to spare everybody else, but can I at least get away, without being murdered? No, she asks for everybody. She seeks justice and life for everyone. For we have been sold, and I and my people are to be destroyed, killed, and wiped out of existence. Now, if we have only been sold as slaves, the men and the women, I would have just stayed silent. I wouldn't have made a big deal about it, because it wouldn't have been a sufficient enough burden to bring to the king. So she would have been okay with us, with the Jews being sold as slaves, and she would have participated in it. She would have been fine with it. She would have accepted that. But it's like they're going to be executed, wiped off the face of the earth. I have to do something about that. This is a sticky situation. Sticky situation. She just revealed that she is a Jew, which Haman just, over the last few days, had been convincing the king that the Jews are evil and terrible, and they needed to be eradicated. They're subversive, disobedient. She's just identified with them. Secondly, now she is saying that you made a mistake by sending that decree to 127 provinces. Yeah, that was a big mistake. So you know what? This is a pretty intense moment. Let's see how the king responds in verse 5. King Xerxes asks the queen, wait a minute. Who is this person who wants to hurt you? Who is he? This guy is just, I don't know what is his problem, but he has no clue what's going on. He's a complete airhead. She's telling him, my people are about to die. They're about to be destroyed. And he can't even remember that he signed the decree. He can't remember that he signed a decree to kill, exterminate a large group of people. And he's so confused. He's like, wait a minute, who's trying to hurt you? Who is this guy? Big dummy. I think that's what happens when, when you're comfortable like a king, right? You got all the stuff you need and all the stuff you want. We can be too comfortable to notice the injustices of the people around us, to notice the oppressed people around us, to notice those who need help, those who really need a helping hand. I was reading this and felt very convicted of that I would like to be more like Esther and running towards justice for the oppressed and to help those who can't help themselves. But that is a side note. So he asks her, well, who did this? Who's trying to kill you? Esther says, and remember, this is at the dinner. The king, Haman, he's the celebrity of the dinner. He's the honored guest. And she says, it's an adversary. It's an enemy. It's Haman. This evil man. I probably would have thrown up or had a seizure or something if I was Haman. Haman became so terrified before the king and queen. Rightly so. It's quite shocking. Then, Haman loves the king. He's trying to mooch off of him and try to feel like royalty and try to feel important. The king stands up in a fury. He is besides himself. He's so angry. And, the verse does say he was drinking wine, so that might have something to do with it. But anyway, he was angry and probably drunk, so he went to the garden so he could decide what to do. He had a lot on his mind. Someone is trying to kill his wife, but his wife's now, she's a Jew, and she's asking for this impossible thing, and I'm going to look like a fool, and I don't know what to do. I think we see a very unique move of God right here. This is cool. So, as you already know, the king's a little bit of an airhead, as I told you, right? He's a little bit of an airhead, not the smartest guy. I think he needed a little extra push to make the right choice. So this is what happens. So Haman stayed and pleaded to the queen, please, please, please don't kill me. Please spare my life, because I know the king is going to kill me. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. You may not think this is a big deal, but at this time in Persian culture, any man who comes near your wife as a royal person, a person of royalty, it's a capital offense. It's like you're trying to get next to my wife, really? Like, you already have embarrassed yourself, and you've already been pointed out as a dirty scoundrel, and you're trying to get next to my wife? And you think, Jeremiah, right here, you think that I might be hyperbolizing, and you think I might be exaggerating, but let's read what the king says. Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was, and the king said, "Are you kidding me? Will he even attempt to assault the queen with me in the palace?" Right there, the king spoke these words, and the servants covered Haman's face in preparation for his execution. I think this is where God chimed in one more time. Hey, the king needed a little extra push, so Haman did it himself. He's right there at the queen's feet. Boom, done. Capital punishment, easy. So what's this thing with covering his face, right? It's kind of weird. What would you mean? He's there and then there's a napkin put on his face for some reason? Well, this was actually customary at the time. Once you're pronounced a criminal, it's a symbol of you being unworthy of even looking at the face of the king. So they covered his face. The servants covered his face, right? Not only that, but it also meant that you were no longer worthy of beholding light. Instead, you'd be covered with the napkin or whatever it is to show you that death and darkness are your future. That was a symbol of you're about to get executed. Now, how are we going to kill this guy? That's a good question. How do we kill him? There's plenty of ways to do it. Of course, if you watch Netflix, there's plenty of ways to do it. Wonder what we could do. Well, this eunuch says, the servant says, hey, wait a minute. There's a gallows. There's a big spike, 75 feet up. It's ginormous, king. You're not going to believe it. And guess what? It's at Haman's house. How convenient. Why don't we hang him there? Why don't we kill him on that spike? Let's throw him on the spike that he built for Mordecai. And the king said, do it. Do it. Satan has also designed a trap. It's called death. It's a trap that's going to take all of us. But God, in the end, will reverse what Satan meant to do for evil and turn it upon himself. Eventually, Satan will be caught in the same trap that he built for us. He will be destroyed. And this is it's not beautiful, maybe that's not the right word. This is a fantastic parallel to what happens at the end of time with Satan. There's hope. So they hanged him on the gallows. They were the gallows prepared for Mordecai, and the king and his anger subsided. This is a fascinating story. And I think there's so many takeaways, we could spend hours talking about them. But personally, I feel like the major takeaway from this story is that God is at work, especially if you can't see it. Furthermore, even when you feel like the adversary, the enemy is pressing upon you with all he has, he's about to exterminate you, God is at work. God is at work. No matter what these two interesting organs on your face see, God is at work. And there's proof of it. You think the story of Esther is like unique? Oh, God showed up and it was kind of miraculous and this is cool, it was invisible. No. Let me ask you something. How many of you in here have seen the invisible God in your life save you from the adversary? Let me tell you something. There are some people in this room, literally, there's probably a couple of people in this room who are only here because God saved them from the adversary. And he, as he did it here, is not going to stop. He's still doing it in your life, and he's going to continue doing it in your life, no matter what our eyes see. We walk by faith, trusting in his promises. I'm going to ask the musicians to come up so we can just worship and reflect. These lyrics to these songs are like really well chosen, Ben. I mean, they're on point with the message. And I want you, while we're worshiping, to not only pay attention to the lyrics, but see if God is tugging on your heart and he's trying to remind you, I'm here. Don't be scared. Don't fear. I'm here. Trust me. Trust the enemy. I don't care how good he is. I don't care how strategic. I don't care how amazing his tactics are. I'm doing something. I'm up to something. Put on your spiritual eyes so you can see. So you can see me show up in the impossible. Let's stand. We're going to worship the God of the impossible. The God who works in the invisible, in the unseen. The one who's done plenty in your life, and he's not done yet. There is so much to be done.